Hello, St. Lukers, and welcome to Your Week with St. Luke's, our weekly podcast from St. Luke's United Methodist Church in Orlando, Florida, where we seek to learn God's story so that we can live, love, and lead a life following Jesus. I'm Pastor Melissa, and I am excited to be guiding you through this series. We are attending Love University this year, and we have made it to our fall schedule. We are in our second week of history class, and we are working our way through the Hebrew Bible throughout the next few weeks. Now, we already heard the story of Joseph in drama class, and last week we moved into the beginning of Exodus, looking at the new king who came on the scene who did not know Joseph and had put out a pretty serious vendetta on the Hebrews there in Egypt, including to the directive to kill all the firstborn sons. Now, this is where we get the story of Moses, one of those all-stars of Scripture. We get the story of baby Moses being saved from this terror by being placed in a basket and put into a river, where he is saved and raised in the king's palace as a son. Well, Exodus chapter 2 gives us a picture of Moses' life from there. His life has been marked by displacement. He was born under Pharaoh's decree of death. He was hidden by his mother, placed in a basket among the reeds, drawn from the water by Pharaoh's daughter, raised in Pharaoh's household, and yet somehow still connected to his Hebrew people. As an adult, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people, and he acted violently, killing the Egyptian and hiding him in the sand. This is one of those parts of Moses' story we often leave out, but it's a key one to understand the whole of who Moses is and was. So when he got found out, when the deed became known, Moses fled from Pharaoh and settled in Midian. And by the time we meet him in Exodus 3, he has built a whole other life. He has married Zipporah. He has a son. He is shepherding the flock of his father-in-law. And after all of that, we get another one of the most well-known stories in Scripture. So let's pick up and hear what happens in Exodus chapter 3, starting with verse 1. Moses was taking care of the flock for his father-in-law, Jethro, Midian's priest. He led his flock out to the edge of the desert, and he came to God's mountain called Horeb. The Lord's messenger appeared to him in a flame of fire in the middle of a bush. And Moses saw that the bush was in flames, but it didn't burn up. And then Moses said to himself, "Let me check out this amazing sight and find out why the bush isn't burning up." When the Lord saw that he was coming to look, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "I'm here." And then the Lord said, "Don't come any closer. Take off your sandals because you are standing on holy ground." He continued, "I am the God of your father, Abraham's God, Isaac's God, and Jacob's God." And Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And then the Lord said, "I have clearly seen my people oppressed in Egypt. I have heard their cry of injustice because of their slave masters. I know about their pain, and I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptians in order to take them out of that land and bring them to a good and broad land, a land that's full of milk and honey, a place where the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites all live." Now the Israelites' cries of injustice have reached me. I've seen just how much the Egyptians have oppressed them, so get going. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I to go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And God said, "I'll be with you, and this will show you that I am the one who sent you. After you bring the people out of Egypt, you will come back here and worship God on this mountain." Now let's stop here for a moment. This is that burning bush story, the one that I know I've heard a few of you reference when talking about what is it that God might want you to do. We wish we could have a burning bush in our life to speak to us and make it clear. But let's take this piece by piece. We see here Moses tending sheep. Now, often we think of the Charlton Heston powerful Moses, "let my people go" moment. But before we get there, it begins in a desert with Moses as a simple shepherd in a quiet place, doing simple and quiet work. He's at the edge of the desert to Mount Horeb. And let's look at that place, because at the end of this section, it says that after Moses brings his people out of Egypt, he will come back to worship God on this mountain. Now, you may or may not know the name Mount Horeb, but you may know its other name, Mount Sinai. Yes, the same place that Moses receives this calling from God is the place that he will also then receive the first 10 commandments. In this moment, Moses is living in exile, away from Egypt, away from the suffering of his people, away from the place where his story began. But now he gets this calling that he is going to have to go back to Egypt. And if I were Moses, I do not think that is what I would want to hear, regardless of who is saying it, even if it is God, God's self. Because when God appears to Moses here, God appears to someone who is not obviously positioned for leadership. Moses is not in Egypt organizing resistance. He's not publicly identifying himself as Israel's deliverer. He is out beyond the familiar, literally at the edge of the desert, near Horeb, the mountain of God. The location itself matters because Moses in this moment is in a liminal place. He's in this threshold place. He is between worlds, Egyptian and Hebrew, palace and wilderness, past and future, exile and calling. And it's in that in-between place that God interrupts him and God calls him. And how God calls him is significant because the text says that the Lord's messenger appeared to him in a flame of fire in the middle of a bush. And when Moses saw that bush in flames, it didn't burn up. This is what we refer to as a theophany, a manifestation of God's presence. The ordinary landscape becomes charged with divine mystery. A bush burns, but it's not consumed. Fire appears, but it doesn't destroy. Moses sees something that should not be possible. And so he has to turn aside to look. The act of turning aside here is small, but it's significant because Moses says to himself, let me check this out and see why this bush isn't burning up. He begins with having his attention grabbed. He notices what is unusual and he allows himself to be interrupted. He doesn't keep walking. He doesn't treat the bush as irrelevant. He turns aside, and when he does, the encounter deepens. And this is when God calls to him, calls him by name from out of the bush. And there's something that's very evocative here. God appears and Moses notices. Moses turns aside, God calls his name. This isn't an abstract announcement. This is a personal calling to someone that God knows. Before Moses is given a task, Moses is called by name. And Moses responds, I'm here. In Hebrew, this response echoes the language of availability that we see elsewhere in Scripture when you hear, Here I am, Lord. It's the response of Abraham and Jacob and Samuel and Isaiah and others when God calls. And it doesn't necessarily mean that Moses understands what's coming. It doesn't mean he's confident or ready. It does mean, though, that he is present enough to answer, or at least hear a proposal, I like to say. He stands before the one who has called him by name, but this is where God sets a boundary. Don't come any closer. Take off your sandals because you are standing on holy ground. The ground is not suddenly becoming holy here. God is giving Moses an awareness of something that already is around him. That the wilderness, this desert edge, this place of exile, this place where he's doing ordinary work, even this is holy ground. And God not only names Moses, but identifies God's self by recounting the lineage. I am the God of your father, Abraham's God, Isaac's God, and Jacob's God. This brings us back to that central theme we see at the beginning of Exodus, that the Israelites have a past. Moses has a past, even though his past more recently is marked by displacement. God doesn't introduce God's self as an unknown deity with a brand new project. This is not a brand new journey that's about to begin. This is a continuation of a story that God has already been telling through Moses' ancestors. The burning bush part is new, but the God who speaks from it is not new. The calling is new, but it is a calling rooted in covenant. It's not a departure from the covenant story, it's a continuation of it. And Moses responds by hiding his face because he's afraid to look at God. It's appropriate. It's appropriately responded to in the presence of this divine holiness. Because he is standing before the God of his ancestors, the God that he has heard about from ancestors, the God whose presence makes the ground holy. And this God is starting to disrupt his life. And God here makes some claims. In verses 7 through 10, we get to kind of the heart of this passage. We think of it often as the calling or as the burning bush, but the heart of this passage is when God recounts what God has seen and why God is there to begin with. We see that God has seen the oppression of God's people in Egypt, which Moses knows very well. And we have 4 verbs that we kind of see here. We hear that God sees. And often the slavery and enslavement of peoples is an attempt to erase those people. Pharaoh sees the Israelites as labor, as a threat, as a population to be managed, but God sees my people and sees the truth of their suffering as they are enslaved. Then we hear that God hears. In Exodus 2, we actually hear this incredible sort of onomatopoetic moment where the Israelites groan under their hard work and their cry rises up. And here God tells Moses that those cries have been heard. The God of Exodus is not deaf to the pain of the oppressed, even though Pharaoh may ignore it. Then third, we hear that God knows. And this knowing is more than information. It is an intimate, relational, compassionate knowledge. God isn't a distant observer collecting data about suffering of a people. The suffering of God's people is close to God's heart. And then finally, God comes to rescue. This is the story of liberation, where God doesn't just observe or critique. God moves and shows up. And this is where the turn happens. Because God tells Moses it's time for him to get moving. Because if I were Moses, I would have some questions in this moment. What happened here? Because I thought you just said, God, you were coming to rescue your people. And you just told me to go do something. What shifted here? God, were you lying to me? No, what we see here is an example of how God works. God is coming to liberate God's people, and Moses is God's instrument in this moment. Moses will carry the message. Moses will do the work of liberation. Because you see, this is a story of calling. Calling is how we see God enacting God's work in the world, both in this ancient context and in our lives today. God has a plan, and as we like to say, that plan is us. God chooses to use humanity throughout all of human history to bring God's work to life in the world. Imperfect humans though they are, we have already heard that Moses killed a man. But just like God used the midwives to rescue Moses, even if we didn't get quite as full or explicit of a call story as we do here, we see yet another way that God is using humanity to rescue God's people. And it's important to notice that God's calling didn't come in Pharaoh's palace, though it certainly could have. And honestly, for all we know, God has been calling Pharaoh all along to do this same liberative work, and Pharaoh has not responded to God's calling. For Moses, this calling came in the desert. Because what we see here is a declaration that God's calling can happen in pretty much any setting, including a barren wasteland, can be to anyone, even a shepherd, and even someone who has murdered. But this scene is not only about Moses discovering his individual vocation, it's about the beginning of a new chapter in the life of this people. The mission is not simply, Moses, go discover your purpose. The mission is, bring my people out of Egypt. Because the call of Moses is inseparable from the call of Israel. And just as an aside, when we use the term Israel, when we're talking about these Hebrew scriptures, these Old Testament texts, we're not talking about a country. Even when they say the word nation, we are talking about a people. We are talking about a group of people that has been mobile at different times, has wandered in the wilderness. That was Israel. The group that was enslaved in Egypt, that was Israel. When we talk about Israel, we're talking about a people. And I know that can kind of be confusing in our current modern day context, where that is a designated plot of land that is a country. But when God says, bring my people out of Egypt, that is part of the call of Israel. God is beginning to form a liberated people, and Moses' vocation exists for the sake of that people's deliverance, worship, and future. Not to form a new nation, not to build a new nation, but the nation that already exists, regardless of where they are. Now, Exodus 3 is the beginning of something significant, because we start to see the transition from hidden divine presence to explicit divine action, from Israel's groaning to God's response, this announced deliverance from survival to liberation. And I think one of those places that we can't let go in this story is to hear and pay really close attention to Moses' response. Because it can be really great to celebrate this big calling that Moses has been given. But Moses' first response is not confident, but protest. Probably what many of us would say. He says, who am I to go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Who am I? What do you mean, me? And who am I in here? It can mean a number of different things. It could mean, what authority do I have? What role do I have? What qualifies me to be the person to do this? It could mean, why would anyone listen to me? It could even be Moses taking ownership of what he knew was in his past. It can mean, do you remember my past? God, surely you saw that. Why would you call me? You saw what I did in Egypt. And it can mean, am I doomed if I go back? It's not a safe place for him. And so Moses has really good reasons to ask this question. This isn't just, pushing back or rebelling or pushing on God's calling. This is Moses actually processing this aloud, because he fled Egypt as a wanted man. And so he's a complicated figure with a complicated identity. But God doesn't respond to Moses' question of qualification with a list of resume lines. God doesn't even say, Moses, you're more capable than you think. You got this. He doesn't give him a motivational speech about leadership potential. God's response is simple. I'll be with you. God's promise is not, you're enough on your own, you've got this. God's promise is, you will not go alone. This is part of something we see throughout all of Scripture, which I refer to as withness. That what we see of God throughout history with God's people is this promise of being with. And of course, we know the rest of that story and the withness of Jesus and the incarnation, the birth of Christ into our worlds. But we see that already in Moses' story. God's promise in his calling is, you will not do this alone. And then Moses is given a sign that after he does this work, he will come back and worship God on this mountain. Now, it's a strange kind of sign. It's not one that really gives him immediate confidence, because you only get this sign once you have started the mission. Once you have agreed to take a few steps at least. He has to go and participate in this calling before he gets to see this sign of God's calling. But it's here where the mountain where Moses is encountering God privately will ultimately be the mountain where that liberated people, that community worships God together. And this movement is key because Exodus 3 begins with that singular person standing alone on holy ground. But God is casting this vision of a whole community listening, learning, standing on holy ground, liberated. So it's not just the vocation of Moses. It's not just Moses' calling in this moment. It is also God spelling out some of the calling of the community as a whole. And this is one of those patterns we see in scripture, God calling an individual for the sake of a community. Abraham is called so that all families of the earth can be blessed. Moses is called so that Israel is delivered. Prophets are eventually called so that people can hear the word of the Lord. Mary is called so that Jesus can be born for the world. Biblical calling, Christian calling, we would say, is rarely about personal fulfillment alone. It generally is going to turn us toward others and invite us not just into our own redemptive work, but into God's redemptive work for those around us and for the world we find ourselves in. You know, here at this burning bush moment, Moses discovers that the cries of Israel have become the concern of God. He discovers that holy ground is not an escape from his history, but it's actually the place where God is going to send him back into his story. And he discovers that divine presence is not merely for comfort, but for mission. And that the God of his ancestors is also the God of the oppressed present and the liberated future. So Exodus 3 is a beginning, but it's not the beginning of Moses' story necessarily. It's a continuation of, of all that God has already been doing through the ancestors. It is the beginning of a communal exodus, where we get the name of the book. And it's the beginning of Israel learning again who God is and who they are. It's the beginning of a movement from groaning to worship, and from imperial control to divine redemption and rescue. Now, this week in worship, we are going to be looking at the beginnings of our Methodist movement alongside this story, and how John Wesley, our movement's founder, sought a kind of liberation as well. He wanted to offer revival to his beloved church, the Church of England, and he wanted to offer relief to those in his community that he saw were suffering, and a church that was doing nothing about it. And he did it through shaping community, through reading scripture together, and ultimately being what he referred to as, quote, more vile than he ever thought he would be. Preaching and teaching outside of the church in fields, being present with people in prison and who were sick, and all of those who were marginalized. But he did it because that's what he heard God calling him to do. And he would say that that's what God calls us to be more concerned with God's justice than with our reputation, and more concerned with God's kingdom than with all of the rules we have made up, to be more concerned with God's people than even our own lives. Now, if you're following along in our book, Wesleyan Vile-tality, here it is if you're watching the video. This is that book by Ashley Bogan. We're going to be reading chapter 1 this week. So you can buy it, download it, listen to it, whatever your method. Just join us this Sunday as we explore our many histories together. And I'll see you there.